The morning sun filtered through the thin white curtains, painting soft golden lines across the small wooden table. Tu Diep stood by the window, her hands gently wiping the glass even though she was still recovering from her illness. The air was cool, the scent of the BBY trees outside mixed with the faint aroma of tea. "Good morning, everyone," she said softly, smiling despite the tiredness in her eyes. In the kitchen, James was helping little Nee tie her shoelaces. "Today we'll go have breakfast together," he said, patting her head. "Then I'll take you to school. Be good, okay?" Nee laughed, her voice clear and sweet like a bell. "Yes, Uncle James. I'll eat all my noodles today." James chuckled. "You mean my daughter, not just Uncle James's friend," he said teasingly. For months now, the three of them had lived together under the same roof. Tu Diep, James, and Nee, forming a small, peaceful family bound not by blood, but by care and love. But peace, James knew, never stayed long. When he received a phone call from an old friend that morning, his tone turned serious. "There's been a small fight at the old house," the voice said. John was involved. John, the man who once betrayed him, the one who caused the collapse of several of his company's branches. James's face hardened, but only for a moment. Then, with calm resolve, he stood up. "I'll go see him," he said quietly. The road to the old house was lined with trees. It had been months since James last came there. When he arrived, John was repairing the wooden fence, his shirt soaked with sweat, but his eyes focused and calm. "James," John greeted, his voice uncertain. James nodded slightly. "I heard you've been living here. How's life treating you?" John smiled faintly. "It's quiet, peaceful. The people around are kind to me." James glanced at the trees, the hens pecking near the porch, and the half-finished roof. "I came for two reasons," he said slowly. "First, to ask if this place is comfortable for you. And second, I heard about the fight at the shop. I want to know what happened." John sighed. "Some of your old workers saw me. They still hate me for what I did. I didn't fight back. Maybe I deserve it." James looked at him for a long time, then nodded. "Maybe, but everyone deserves a chance to change. You can stay here," he said. "The land is mine, but I won't charge you. In return, you'll take care of the grapefruit trees and the chickens." John's eyes widened. "After everything I did to you, you still help me?" James smiled faintly. "I'm not helping you for free. You'll work for it. Besides, everyone deserves to rebuild." For a moment, the wind swept through the garden, carrying away the heaviness between them. When James returned home that afternoon, the house smelled of warm soup. Tu Diep was sitting by the table, still pale but smiling. "You came back early," she said softly. "I went to see John," he replied, placing his coat on the chair. "He's different now." Tu Diep nodded. "People can change if we give them time." James watched her closely. "But you should rest. You're not fully recovered yet." "I'm fine," she said, standing up to wipe the table again. "Just a little work makes me feel better." Tu Diep, James said gently but firmly. "You have to take care of yourself. I don't want to see you in the hospital again." She smiled, lowering her head. "You sound like an old man already." He laughed quietly, then stepped closer and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe I am, but only because I worry too much about you." That evening, the peace was broken again. An old woman knocked on the gate a stranger, yet her eyes carried a familiar sadness. "Are you Tu Diep?" she asked. "I've come to find my granddaughter." "Nee." Tu Diep froze. James stepped forward politely. "I'm James," he said. "Please, come inside." The woman hesitated, looking around the small, tidy house. "I'm Nee's grandmother," she said softly. "I came to take her home." James's expression turned thoughtful. "We know, but Nee has been living here happily. Before making any decision, shouldn't we ask what she wants?" The woman sighed. "She's my blood. She belongs with her family." James replied gently but firmly, "And we are her family by heart, not by blood. Let's wait a few days. When Tu Diep recovers, we'll talk together with Nee and the local authorities. She should have the right to choose where she belongs." The woman hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, but please take good care of her." As she left, Tu Diep stood silently, eyes glistening. James placed his hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he whispered. "Whatever happens, we'll protect her." Together, outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The evening sky glowed orange, and somewhere in the distance, Nee's laughter echoed like a promise of hope, a small light in the midst of their uncertain future. The days passed quietly after Nee's grandmother left, but her words lingered in Tu Diep's mind like a soft echo. Every time she saw Nee running in the garden, or heard her laughter blending with the rustling of the grapefruit trees, her heart trembled with fear, the fear of losing someone she had come to love as her own. James noticed it too. One evening, as the sky faded into a tender purple, he sat beside Tu Diep under the veranda. She was shelling peanuts, her hands moving slowly, lost in thought. "Diep," he began gently, "are you still worried about Nee's grandmother?" She didn't look up. I don't want to be selfish. If Nee belongs with her family, I can't stop it. But I can't bear the thought of waking up one morning and not hearing her voice anymore." James reached out, taking her hands into his. "Love isn't selfish," he said quietly. "You gave her a home when no one else did. That's something even blood can't replace." Tu Diep looked into his eyes, and for a moment, the silence between them was filled with the unspoken bond they had built through pain, loss, and hope. James took a deep breath. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you." She blinked, confused. "What is it?" He smiled softly and pulled out a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside lay a delicate silver ring with a tiny diamond that shimmered in the fading light. "Marry me, Tu Diep," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Let's build a real family, not one born from circumstance, but from love and choice. I want you and Nee to be part of my life forever." Tears welled into Diep's eyes. She covered her mouth, unable to speak. The air felt still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she whispered, "Yes, James, yes." James laughed softly in relief, slipping the ring onto her finger. Then he drew her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I promise," he whispered, "no matter what happens, we'll protect this family." The following weeks were filled with gentle excitement. The villagers came to help decorate the small house. Nee ran around holding flowers, shouting, "Auntie Diep is going to be a bride." The sight made everyone laugh. James worked tirelessly to finish his projects at the company. Despite the struggles of the past, his business was finally recovering. Investors were returning, and trust was being rebuilt. It was as if fate itself wanted to give him one more chance, one he intended to use wisely. But beneath the joy, a quiet tension brewed. Nee's grandmother hadn't returned since that evening, but a letter came one morning. It was sealed in an old envelope with trembling handwriting. "Dear James and Miss Diep, I am grateful for all the love you have given my granddaughter, but I am old and sick. Before I leave this world, I only wish to see her one last time. Please allow her to visit me. I promise I will not take her away." Tu Diep held the letter tightly. "James," she said softly, "we should let her go. It's the right thing." James nodded. "Yes, but I'll go with her. I don't want anything to happen." That weekend, they took Nee to a small village by the river where the grandmother lived. The old woman's face lit up when she saw the girl. Nee ran into her arms, crying with joy. The reunion was touching, filled with tears and laughter. When they prepared to leave, the grandmother took Tu Diep's hands. "You are a good woman," she said. "Thank you for loving my granddaughter as your own. I know now that she has found her real family with you." Tu Diep's eyes brimmed with tears. "Please rest well," she whispered. "You'll always be part of our lives." As they drove back home, Nee fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting on a small pillow. James glanced at Tu Diep, who was staring out the window, smiling faintly. "Next week," he said quietly, "will you wear white or pink?" She turned to him, laughing softly. "White, of course, good," he said, smiling, "because that's the color of beginnings and ours is just about to start." The morning sun rose softly over the valley, casting golden light across the fields. The wedding was only a few days away. The small village buzzed with excitement. Neighbors were preparing flowers, tables, and lanterns. Tu Diep spent her mornings sewing ribbons and arranging decorations, her face glowing with quiet happiness. But that peace didn't last long. One afternoon, when James was away in the city to finalize business arrangements, a black car stopped in front of the house. Two men stepped out, wearing formal suits. Their expressions were serious. Tu Diep came out to greet them, confused. "Can I help you?" One of them spoke politely, but firmly. "We're from the Child Welfare Department. There has been a request from Nie's biological relatives to reassess her custody." Tu Diep froze. "What? But Nie's grandmother already. She passed away last night." The man interrupted gently. "Her nephew has filed for custody, claiming that Nie should live with her biological family." The words hit her like a thunderclap. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to process what was happening. "No, she belongs here. She's happy here." The men looked at her sympathetically. "We understand, ma'am, but we need to follow the procedure. We'll have to speak to Mr. James as well." That night, when James returned home, he found Tu Diep sitting on the porch, hugging Nie tightly. Her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as he ran toward her. "James, they want to take her away." James clenched his fists, trying to control his anger. He knelt beside them, gently stroking Nie's hair. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. "I won't let them take her." The next few days were filled with anxiety. James called lawyers, submitted documents, and met with officials to explain the truth, that Nie had been abandoned and that Tu Diep had given her a home when no one else would. Meanwhile, Nie seemed to sense the tension. She became quieter, staying close to Tu Diep all the time. One night, she whispered, "Auntie Diep, are they sending me away?" Tu Diep held her close. "No, sweetheart. You're our family. No one can change that." When the court hearing day arrived, Tu Diep wore a simple white dress. Her hands trembled as she sat beside James. In the small courtroom, the man who claimed to be Nie's relative sat across the room, expressionless. As the judge listened to the statements, James stood and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, this woman beside me, Tu Diep, gave Nie life again. I saw how that little girl came from fear to laughter, from loneliness to love. No blood relation can replace that. I am ready to take full responsibility as her guardian. I will raise her as my own daughter." The room went silent. Even the judge seemed moved by his words. Tu Diep reached for his hand under the table, her heart pounding with both fear and gratitude. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "The court recognizes the emotional bond and stability provided by Mr. James and Ms. Tu Diep. The custody of the child, Nie, will remain under their care." Tears rolled down Tu Diep's cheeks. Nie ran to her, hugging her tightly. James smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with relief. Outside the courtroom, as they stepped into the sunlight, Tu Diep whispered, "James, we did it." He looked at her, brushing a tear from her face. "No," he said softly, "she did it. You saved her, Diep." That night, for the first time in weeks, the house was filled with laughter again. Nie helped hang paper lanterns while James and Tu Diep decorated the small altar. For the upcoming wedding, the storm had passed, and what remained was love, stronger than ever. The wedding day arrived beneath a sky painted with soft morning light. The garden was filled with white and yellow flowers, their fragrance floating gently through the air. Neighbors gathered, smiling and whispering blessings as the music began. Tu Diep stood in a simple white dress, her eyes shining like dawn. James couldn't take his eyes off her. When she walked toward him, every hardship, every tear they had endured seemed to fade into the distance. Little Nie, wearing a small pink dress, held the rings on a tiny pillow. As she handed them to James, she looked up and whispered, "Daddy, promise you'll never leave Mommy." James smiled and bent down. "I promise, my little star." He took Tu Diep's hand and placed the ring gently on her finger. "No matter how hard life gets," he said softly, "I will protect you both for the rest of my life." Tu Diep's eyes filled with tears. "And I'll walk with you through every season," she replied. The guests applauded, and the sound of laughter mingled with the song of the wind. Nie ran between them, her laughter like bells ringing through the garden. As evening fell, lanterns lit up the sky. James pulled Tu Diep close and whispered, "This isn't just our wedding day. It's the day our family begins again." Tu Diep smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Yes, James, we're finally home, and under the warm glow of the lanterns, surrounded by love. Their story, once filled with pain and trials, finally found peace. Love is not measured by blood, nor by the name written on a family book. It is built through care, sacrifice, and the courage to stay when life becomes hard. James and Tu Diep's journey teaches us that happiness does not come easily. It grows from tears, forgiveness, and faith in one another. When Nie was nearly taken away, they learned that family is not something you inherit. It's something you choose, protect, and nurture. True love is not about perfection. It's about standing together through pain and storms, never giving up even when hope seems small. James showed what it means to be a man who loves selflessly, protecting not only the woman he loves, but also the child who needed him most. Tu Diep showed the quiet strength of a woman whose heart was big enough to love without expecting anything in return. And little Nie reminded them both that joy can bloom even from broken beginnings. Their story is a gentle reminder to all of us. Home is not a place, but a feeling, a safe space built from kindness and understanding. When two hearts choose to love and forgive, even after countless trials, they create something unbreakable. In the end, it was not fate that kept them together. It was choice, and sometimes the most powerful promise of all is simply to stay.